Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. This is going to be episode number 20 of Help Action. And sorry for the simulate start. For some reason, my computer wanted to disconnect from the internet just for a second, but I think we're back. Hopefully, everybody out there can see and hear us. So we're going to get rolling. Tonight, we're going to be talking about genre blending. It's pretty straightforward as to what we're talking about, but we'll get into that in just a second. First, I would like to welcome my guest for this evening from Dice on Ice RPG, Connor Davies. So, Connor, how are you, son of a bitch?
I'm doing quite good today. It's incredibly freezing out there. We've reaching temperatures that rival both the Arctic and Antarctic right now.
Well, you live in the North Pole, so
close enough, right?
Close enough for me.
Yeah, it's apparently we're getting a nice warm wind next week, so it'll warm up a bit.
It might hit zero.
Well, it's still going to be way below zero, but it'll warm up considerably.
Goodness, man. Yeah. You people are crazy and brave. All right. So yeah, tonight like I said, we're going to be talking about genre blending. But it's something that I have seen you do a few times, and we can kind of get into a little bit more of the specifics here towards the end. But where can everybody find you? What do you usually get up to?
Well, you can find me scarcely on the YouTube channel Dice on Ice, where I have run games in the past. We've had some character build videos, some other RPG advice, a lot of sessions if you're into that, various campaigns. I run the channel with my wife Megan, who also runs games and has videos of a variety of things on there. So if you look interested in that, check us out. If you're not, then I'm sorry. I don't know.
It's so Canadian of you. You just apologize if someone doesn't want to watch your stuff.
Whatever, Sorry, man. Can't make everyone happy.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, dude. This has been a long time coming. I wanted to make sure that I had a topic that I felt was a good fit to ask you on.
I think we lost him. Maybe I'm the one that's lost. Hey, chat. Can you hear me? Looks like you're back.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I have no idea what is going on. My internet keeps telling me that it's trying to go out and that my Wi-Fi is not working properly, but I'm hardwired into the router. So who knows? Technology.
Who knows? It's a fickle.
It is. I'm sure it's going to keep doing that. So please bear with me. Hopefully we will be able to get through this and everything continues to mostly work. Yes, as Karen pointed out, we're matching today. Believe it or not, that wasn't planned.
A sheer coincidence. Or was it really a coincidence?
There are no coincidences, Connor.
Yes.
Coincidence.
Coincidences.
It's going to be a long night, folks.
Yep.
Buckle in. Okay, so like I've said a couple of times before, we're going to talk about genre blending. So I think that most people understand what we're talking about when we use the term, but this technique of kind of mixing two seemingly unrelated genres is something that I use a lot in my games. So I feel like it's an important tool for people to understand. So what I'm curious about, though, is how useful do you find this to be? What applications do you think that it might have?
I like to use genre blending, and I think it's useful to give people a kind of a fresh take on things that they already might love, and also a way to just you only have so many days to live. Might as well put your two favorite things together and experience them at the same time. As much is like like you like this part of you like the Force of Star Wars, and you like the monastic traditions of Buddhism. So let's mash them together and make a new kind of story out of it. That's literally just an off the cuff example. It was a pretty bad one, but then you could mix these together, and I think it gives you like a fresh take, as I said, while also just feeling very, very like satisfying and recognizable. And for anyone that likes the source materials plural, because you're blending, of course.
Yeah, I've always really liked that part of it. It's because there's a familiarity to what you've kind of used when you are blending well-known genres at the very least, and it's still kind of fresh, like you said. It's a new take or a new spin on an old classic, if you will. And I think it's a really elegant way to make things new out of old parts. Things that have been around for a long time and people have seen them done 100 times before. But if you can come along and figure out a new way to piece them together and make something wholly different out of it, it feels good as a creator.
Yeah, absolutely. And it lets your players, not even, I guess, in the sense of and RPGs, of course, that's what we're really talking about here. It gives them the ability to feel like they know what's going to happen next, while also leaving the option for surprises, because they know kind of the gimmicks of a zombie story, for example. Like the Walking Dead kind of feel, and people also know the gimmicks of a Western, or cowboys in a saloon. But when you put them together, things that normally seem pretty discordant, you can always keep them surprised at turn by turn, but they're also like, oh, this is actually the source of the epidemic. Well, also like, oh man, this is just a dry gulch, and my cow, this is the only well in this like dry gulch. You're like, oh, you kind of put it together, and something that you wouldn't really know about. Or it gives you a new surprise that you probably wouldn't even have if you kept to one or the other.
Yeah, and I think those kinds of parts or pieces or recognizable bits or whatever you want to call them, one genre really only has so many that are recognizable. But when you're taking multiple genres, you're increasing the amount of parts and bits that you have to build from. So you have, 3 times, 2 times the amount of pieces with which to put things together. And typically, if a trope is basically what we're kind of talking about, is ingrained deeply enough in a specific genre, even if it's not immediately recognizable at first, when you pluck that string, most people are going to go, ah, okay. Even if it's somewhat subconscious, they're going to pick up on, this feels like a Western, even though we're playing sci-fi. I now recognize what scene we're in, what's going on, who the bad guy probably is, what I need to say or do next. And it's an unwritten language that kind of passes at the table. And I think it's very, very useful for improv storytelling.
Yeah, it's by sticking with these known substances, you're able to keep people kind of on the same page in what really was really going on, while also being a fresh take, or at least fresh, somewhat in a somewhat, to the sense, is like everyone kind of knows what's going on to a degree, and they're able to kind of like play an improv, as you said, while also keeping a lot of open-ended, like you've tripled the amount of parts that you have access to, right? If zombies bring 3 things and westerns bring 4, now you have 7, and oh man, so many more combinations. Well, everyone knows kind of what those 7 things are, right? So yeah, that's a very good point to the appeal of blending your genres together, especially if they're a bit like harmonic, rather than discordant. And that's be another discussion almost, is what genres actually blend together better than others.
Yeah, and we may even be able to hit on that here in just a minute. One of the things that we were kind of already circling around, I have another talking point about, is tropes itself. Now, this is something that I've talked about quite a bit. I tend to find tropes to be very, very important. A lot of people kind of give them a bad rap. And I think there's certainly a method in which they can be used that is negative. But tropes are a very important, like I said, for shorthand language between most people who consume stories and media. But particularly whenever you're blending genres, being able to recognize the tropes that span those genres can be really key to the process as well. Finding, something that kind of rings true in both genres that you might be pulling from. What other tools and techniques do you think somebody could use to kind of help blend their genres together?
I think that if there another way beyond just like identifying tropes and common ground of tropes is also finding common ground of their overall appearance, if that makes any sense. Like if both of these stories take place in a desert, so you might even just have common ground there, right? Like, if you're able just to blend together the idea of ancient Egypt and Dune, right? Now all of a sudden you got like these weird pharaonic people, right? Instead of sandworms, you got, weird crocodile monsters in the Nile. It is, very offhand example, but even then you're just like, oh, I've got just even as aesthetic similarity rather than like narrative similarity, is something that you could do as well. Is like, oh, both of these things take place in space. Let's kind of see how they blend together, right? That one has the issues of running into them kind of trying to do too many things at the same time. But if you're able to kind of pick and choose what things really stand out about each unique take in those same aesthetics, you can find something that's a bit fresh and even honestly might even just be just unique to the world in a sense.
Yeah, it's something that is done a lot more often than I think we sometimes even realize in the stories that we consume. It's a very common thing that I think storytellers and writers do to keep things, like you said, unique and fresh, and to incorporate different ideas, new ideas to your audience at least. And we're lucky enough to live in the kind of civilization and technological era that we are able to just consume massive amounts of media in a terrifying variety. Like it's limitless at this point. So having commonalities in storytelling is a very, very useful tool to continually fall back on when playing a game with somebody that is used to an entirely different media consumption than you are. Because as long as those tropes are true across all media or all genre, then you can still kind of tell these stories on the fly without having to have a lot of, hey, that was a little too violent for this kind of story, or what have you. It helps people, like you said, be on the same page.
Absolutely, yeah. And I want to touch on the point about tropes too. Here is tropes are tropes for a reason. I found is like they aren't just tropes because they're commonly used. They're commonly used because they're good. And the only reason why they aren't perfectly good right now is because they're excessively used, or at least commonly used. But there's a reason why we have the thing called the hero's journey that English majors will kind of study and write about, or the many other kind of mythological cycles or storytelling methods we have, or these common tropes of like the synergy between like humans and fire in early times is like it's something you can just literally build a story off of, and it appears everywhere. It's like these are common storytelling vectors because they do their thing well, and so that's, you got to give these respect to these tropes and realize why they exist in these spots. Like, why in a noir is the detective someone who's, got a very kind of shadowed past and a guilty conscience, right? Versus just being a happy-go-lucky, child with a big popsicle. It's these tropes are good vectors, and you can kind of twiddle with them a bit, and push on their strengths or pull away from their weaknesses or give them a fresh twist. But really put your eye on those tropes and really see why they're there, and what really nuanced things they tell. Because, as you said, they're shorthand. They're their own language. Um, like a gentle giant, for example, is a trope. But whenever someone sees someone really big and strong but petting a bunny, they know exactly what kind of character that is, right? Whether it's the Hulk but not angry, or the character from Of Mice and Men, or whatever 100,000 different persons of a big dude petting a hamster, right? It's like this. It tells the character in an image, literally one picture. You can tell a person's trope, and that's kind of a really strong tool that you can use. I think we lost Jeremy again, and he's back. You weren't gone too long.
So I heard all about the gentle giant, which is a fantastic example of a trope at work being used well. And yeah, I could not agree more. Again, I've said it a lot of times on Help Action. Tropes it's an indispensable tool to have in your belt, to not only utilize so that you can hit those kinds of chords with your players, but also so that you're aware of them when they come up, and you can use that to shape your story and hedge the expectations that you need as a DM. If you go into a heist and that's what you're trying to go for, and you lay that down and make it apparent to your players, then you know that there's probably going to be a planning phase, and then there's going to be the part where they pull it off, and then there's going to be the big chase at the end. You kind of have hedged your bets, so you know better what to prepare in order to be ready to improv more freely.
Yeah, and it also just helps people with knowing what kind of game they're about to play. Like, playing a heist game without a planning phase kind of feels off. Playing a heist without a complication in the middle kind of feels like, is this really a heist, right? Or playing a heist where you're not actually stealing something. Okay, well, you got to sell me a bit more on how this actually is a heist, right? So like these kind of key points about the genre you need to hit, and knowing what you need to hit can give you a better storytelling experience. Like, instead of it being a game that feels like it could be a heist, to, oh man, we did a heist, even though we were paladins and sorcerers, and this was actually just a lich's dungeon, but we went about it in a certain way that made it feel more like a heist than just a regular dungeon crawl. And if that was what everyone's going for, then well done. You just pulled a heist and stole the hand of Vecna from a lich, instead of like just mowing down hordes of skeletons in a dungeon.
Yeah, I think that's a very great example of genre blending, even of finding something else that feels like, boom, a heist. What do you need to make that feel right? And then finding a way to put that into something like a Dungeons and Dragons game. It's doable. It's very doable. And a lot of the times when you're able to pull that off, it creates very memorable encounters and sessions. It'll stand out because it breaks the normal expectations it subverts them without breaking them, I guess is probably a better way of putting that. But we have a question from your wife, as a matter of fact. So I'll go ahead. Don't get excited too much there. We can go ahead and get to that before we kind of come back around to some of the other things that I've got. So her question, Megan, thank you very much, is what are your go-to genres that you find are easily blendable with others?
For me, I think the easiest one to blend into something else is dystopian elements, or dystopia, which really is just a question of how can the society of whatever genre I'm working with be pushed in a really negative direction or exaggerated. And so you can make a dystopian Western, you can make a dystopian sci-fi, you can make a dystopian fantasy. You can. I think that dystopian is a really good and easy way to really kind of push the envelope and give people a fresh take. A fresh take on Dungeons and Dragons instead of just being adventurers. Slaughtering skeletons. In a dungeon. It's like, oh well, we're now in a dystopian fantasy world where the real quest is actually against the king himself rather than being the king's vassals. That's one I usually like to go to give. It gives a lot of maneuverability as an agent in that world to make change, which I think is really, side note, an important thing to have in your games for the reason why the player characters are the player characters is to give them like an agency and a reason why they're the protagonist by changing the world through their actions. That's literally a whole other help action you can talk about with someone else. But yeah, dystopian I think is cool. I think that well, how about you? Do you have any that stand out to you?
Yeah, in a similar note, horror. I think horror is a very easy genre to drop into almost any other existing genre. I mean, you could probably no, you absolutely can do romantic horror. I mean, which doesn't sound like it would go together, but there are examples out there. I know at the very first thought, I know there's others. So it even sometimes when it seems like it couldn't be done, it usually can. I think horror is a good one for that. And I think fantasy even can be. I'm finding that it can go with almost anything.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
that's also kind of what I've played for the longest. So
yeah, I think it's honestly the genre that's easily blendable is the one that you're most familiar with. Is probably the best answer. And for me, like I read a lot of like young adult dystopian fiction as a kid, so like that's kind of what I grew up on, along with my fantasy leanings. So like, yeah, sure, those things are really accessible to me, and having horror as an easy avenue as well for someone that's like really kind of in tune with what makes a horror definitely works as well. So I think a lot of people have very different answers to this question without anyone being wrong, which is a good thing.
yeah, I think you probably hit it whenever you suggested it's whichever trope is the most familiar with you, or whichever genre has the most familiar tropes for you. It's kind of just about what you have spent the most time consuming, because that's going to increase your understanding of the language of hitting the tropes, and is going to give you the better tools to do that and have confidence in when you're doing it, because you'll recognize it being right, because you've consumed so much of that type of media. Yeah, good question. Thank you, Megan. So one of the things that I wanted to roll back around is, we've kind of touched on a few, but can you think of any kind of prime examples in mainstream media of pinpointing genre blending in action?
One that I think is kind of really pointed, probably is the Shaun of the Dead trilogy. I think is a really good example of genre blending because of how they just subverted. It's like a combination of subverting a genre and also just like blending it, because they introduced a lot of comedic elements to a genre and made it weird again. Shaun of the Dead did it with regular zombie storytelling. Because like it didn't really feel like a zombie story, even though it was. It also felt like a different kind of story. It felt like a comedy. And then at World's End also was a kind of a funny, weird. It blended together sci-fi and just some dumb, hangover story, or drunken rant story. So I think that line is a very good example of that.
Yeah, I think Shaun of the Dead is a great example. It's definitely comedic horror, and one of the great things that I love about even when you blend the same genres together in different takes, it doesn't have to feel the same. Because another comedy horror would be Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which is a brilliant film. I love it. And it feels nothing like Shaun of the Dead. It's not about zombies, so that's a part of it. But it is a comedy horror. And it's, again, even though they're both kind of the same genres being combined from one. And I think that's another good kind of takeaway from this, is that it doesn't always have to be the same, even though the genres might be, even though the ingredients might be the same, they don't have to be mixed the same way. Speaking of zombies, one of the examples I wanted to bring up was Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which is, it's not Bronte.
That'd be just a textbook example of genre blending.
Yeah, exactly.
It's literally just like it's in the title, right?
Yeah, it's a period piece zombie mashup, which is, again, kind of one of these weird things where you read the concept of it and you're like, what? Like, why?
What?
But sometimes you sit down and watch it and you're like, okay. Or you read the book and you go, I get it now. I see the appeal. And it can be really surprising sometimes.
I think another example of genre blending too that worked really well in the public eye recently is actually this late phase of Marvel movies. They've really blended the superhero genre with the sci-fi genre, especially in Thor Ragnarok, I believe, was the one where they just like had these junkers out in space. And like in Guardians of the Galaxy kind of booted that off of like, oh no, the Marvel universe isn't a superhero universe, but also like a sci-fi one. And so it blended those really weirdly together. And you're like, oh, I guess it works. And then it's just really, really organic now in these really late phase of these movies with the Infinity War and everything else that happens really lately. But I think the kicking off point where I noticed it was in Ragnarok. I'm like, this isn't a superhero movie at all. This is a sci-fi movie. As an example of really recent blending.
Absolutely. And I think furthermore with science fiction, also some examples are Blade Runner, mixing science fiction in the detective noir. Was one of the first times that I've ever seen it done, at least. And now it's kind of spawned its own genre, its own new genre of cyberpunk. Very much kind of grew up out of the happy marriage of two genres that didn't seem related, but had this really great overlap whenever they were combined. And then another one is Star Wars. Very much, it's got finger paws. It pulls from a bunch of different genres and tropes and things and kind of puts it all in a science fiction skin. But particularly The Mandalorian is very much a Western. So you have this science fiction and Western combination, which again is not uncommon. Firefly is another great example of science fiction and Western being combined. And once again, like I said earlier, the two feel valleys apart from one another. Different feels, even though they're pulled from the same well, if you will. Yeah, my internet connection is doing all kinds of crazy shit. So hopefully everybody's caught up and can hear both of us. And I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, it's a little bit choppy from my end, but all the audio is coming through okay for you. So I'm able to keep up pretty well.
Okay, good. Okay. So yeah, it's something that happens a lot, genre blending, and I think when you can be aware of it, you're better equipped to do it yourself. So it broadens your horizons a lot, I think, as a storyteller. So one of the questions that I kind of like to ask that are kind of moving a little ways from the talking points for just a moment is I like to ask my guests, how did that happen? How did you get into this hobby?
Well, I was 4 years old,
Uh-oh.
and my parents had friends come over some nights, um, and they sit around a table, and they little toys would come out, and they'd roll some little plastic bits, and stories would happen. And I was a 4 year old or 6 year old, like who knows how old I was, and it was always bedtime right after they started, and I'm like, what is this? I want to play too. And certainly there as a 6 year old, I had a little fighter, uh, who basically did nothing because I always had to go to bed right as soon as the game started. That's fine. I got 15 minutes of Dungeons and Dragons. That's kind of how I got into it, was be able to play more and more into the night as my bedtime grew later, and then it just kind of spawned into a whole actual lifetime of this stuff. Was actually really I really just dove into the books. Uh, that the in version 3 was what I read a lot of. And then when 4 came out, I'd read all the 4 books, and then when 5 came out, I'm like, you know what, 5's good. And as I got older, I had less time for it. And then as I found it again, really, it's like 5th edition really kind of got me back into the game, because just whether it's like the edition wars, or just the fact that like my life was pretty tumultuous during the times, like 5e's kind of like, you know what, let's play some D&D again. I found time in my life for it again, and it's been great ever since. In fact, we even wrote a book, but I bet you everyone who's watching this probably knows.
I actually have a question about that. And I'll just move right into it. Thank you for the segue.
Oh, perfect.
So I'm very lucky in that my wife does actually play with our weekly home group. But RPGs are not traditionally passionate about. It's just not really ever been her thing. Nor is it really for anybody else in my immediate family. So your wife, Megan, we've already touched on, has already been a guest early on in Help Action, actually. She's not only very active in the community, but you guys, like you said, wrote a book together. And beyond even just the book, your mom is also an active member in the same circles. What I'm curious about is, what is it like having RPGs ingrained so much in your life? Is there ever a point when you feel like it becomes too much of a part?
I find that I'm actually, of the 3 that you've mentioned, the person who plays the RPG is probably the least out of all of us. As I do think there's kind of a nice balancing point of like, okay, you know what, I feel like I only spend 2 evenings a week doing this, and I like to have other hobbies to kind of fill in the gaps. Sometimes I feel a bit more burnt out than normal. Sometimes I really hanker for it. But also, I know that itch that I have is really easy to satisfy. Like, oh, I can just, let's just have another campaign or another game on the fly. And it's really nice to be able to have all these people nearby to bounce ideas off of that actually know what the heck I'm talking about. Instead of like having, a partner or parents or brothers or siblings that don't know really what this thing is you're talking about. And like, yeah, it's just some weird game or something. But be able to kind of like bounce ideas off of, new world ideas, new game mechanic ideas, new campaign ideas. It's good having that accessibility. Though sometimes, yeah, a little burnt out sometimes, but that's what literally any other hobby is for. And it's good to have a balance, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I game quite a bit through on YouTube, on various people's here, my weekly home group, and there's definitely a breaking point. It's probably not the right term, but there's definitely okay, I've done too much this week. I'm feeling drained. My energy, my brain's not firing correctly anymore. My emotions are all emptied. So there's definitely a good medium in finding whatever that medium is for you in particular. I think they understand. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your book, since we're kind of talking about it as it is.
Well, I'm scanning my immediate vicinity for a copy, and it is slightly out of reach. Oh well. It is a setting
Megan,
for.
stat.
Now she's too busy playing on the Xbox, so unfortunately she cannot run.
Aha!
Caught in the act.
She goes.
It is a setting book for 5th edition D&D called Cryphos, and it is essentially a world where the demons took over and the last remaining few people are kind of clan together to either wallow in misery, as some of the generic people of the world do, or unite and fight against this otherworldly horror. And here it is. Here's a copy of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Megan. And it's a cool book you can buy on DriveThruRPG. It's compatible with 5th edition D&D, and pick up the book and run it out of the box, kind of thing. It's got races, new mechanics for more gritty survival-based games. It's got some cool demon lords in it, some class options. It's a lot of world building tools for you to build your own rendition of the world to throw at your players. And for people that are looking for a Dark Sun fix that won't be sated for quite a bit, since Wizards hasn't announced anything official about a Dark Sun product. It's not quite the same, but it kind of touches on a few similar notes. You can probably even adapt it for actual Dark Sun stuff. That's what I've heard a lot of people do with it as well. Not only taking it at face value, but using its tools as a vector for their own Dark Sun addictions. Go ahead and use it for that too. It's probably a great tool for that.
Yeah. It's incredibly impressive that the two of you put that together. Just the two of you, and in the amount of time that you did, no less. I sadly do not have a physical copy. I have the PDF.
Our artist did a wonderful job at all the art in the book. Brandish Gilham of Runehammer Games. He's just a fantastic artist. So yeah, kudos to him for making our book look so sharp.
It's a very, very cool thing that you should be very, very proud of. Okay, we actually had another preloaded question, also from Megan. I'm going to go ahead and drop that in here. What are some tips for blending genres and still making them feel distinct and not muddied?
So that's, I guess, overall getting to that really off-the-cuff point I made earlier in this segment about making sure that your genres are synergistic rather than discordant. And it's a really hard thing to really narrow down what the difference is there. But overall, it's making sure that your pieces feel like they belong together anyways, and they don't conflict, unless that conflict is something you're going for. Like, for example, in Cyberpunk, you have a lot of anti-establishment sentiment. And then blending with something that had a lot of, or just didn't really focus on that at all, might not be the best thing to blend it with. And so basically avoiding those mixed feelings that you might get with certain genres being blended together. If you can avoid those or make sense of those dissimilarities, that's kind of where you can make sure that you don't get too muddied. Is making sure that they have kind of a focus that synergizes. I'm using corporate buzzwords here, but it's the best I can do with that. It's making sure that their overall messages line up correctly, or make sure that the feelings are the same, I guess. If both of these genres imply a very heavy empire state, then make sure that empire state is there and not lacking. But if one of them requires, exploring a whimsical woods, and the other one, implies exploring a big city center, then how are you going to reconcile those, really? Unless it's like a city of gnomes in a forest or something, which is that really going to be cyberpunk? I mean, maybe you can have cyberpunk, gnomes and mushroom houses, but that's a bit more muddied than synergistic, unless you're going to make it work, in which case, honestly, go for it. Like, I give you full license over cyberpunk and gnomes and mushroom forests.
Smurfs 27/7.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I think when you run into situations where you feel like the waters are becoming muddy, see if you can't reconcile both things to be true. When you're combining ideas together, typically the best stuff doesn't come from this or this. It's how you can make it so that both of those things are true at the same time. And the really interesting stuff I have found is where that blending happens. That answer that you can come up with so that these two things can is often that's the stuff where you're like, that's mine. Like, I did that, and that's the thing that's fun and exciting and memorable. And it's typically the things that your players are going to latch onto the most, I have found, because it's something different, something new.
Yeah, like if you have a piece that follows two overlapping tropes, excuse me, of the two genres or touchstones, that's the synergy that I've tried to dance around, but ultimately didn't get to the point. You nailed it quite well. It was just like, this thing here falls under both of those things and works well. It's a very good way of explaining it.
Thank you. So kind of discussing this process is somewhat of a follow-up to a technique that I touched on in my last episode with Caius Wallen. What I talk about him with is stripping back all of the layers until you can extract just the kernels of what works from any given source of inspiration, what it is that makes it feel blank. And then that way you can then relayer on the coats of paint so that you can make these disparate kernels all feel more cohesive. Do you find yourself using a similar process?
I think I do use that process, and I also use its opposite, being that I take coats of paint, and put them on other things. Like, I'll take the coat of paint of Star Wars and slap it on, something else, to blend them together. Because I find a lot of the visceral touchstones of something might even just be like how it looks, or I want my evil person to be wrinkled and old and shoot lightning out of his fingers. Like, okay, that's just taking what a Sith Lord looks like, right, in Star Wars, but I want to put that in my fantasy world. Okay, sure, go for it, right? Or in whatever. Like, it was taking these coats of paint and even like but doing the same thing that we've described earlier with how we can blend tropes of like making sure that this coat of paint also matches this coat of paint, right? So if my lich in a dungeon also shoots lightning out of his fingers, right, and is like the antithesis of my heroes, he's both a Sith Lord and a lich, right, which kind of falls under fantasy and Star Wars, for a really bad example as well. So not only do I find myself pulling back, like, what makes a cyberpunk, or what makes Dune, or whatever. I'll also just like, what makes this look like this, and I'll take what it looks like and throw it on something else. And I often use this thing more with particular pieces of fiction rather than genres as a whole, right? I'll take what does a Space Marine of Warhammer 40k look like, and I'll throw that into, again, a fantasy world. Instead of them being augmented by old science, they're augmented by old alchemy, but they'll have their extra organs, they'll be tall, and they can kill 40 people, and there'll be an army of super soldiers in my fantasy world that this wizard has created or something, or this alchemist has created. So I use that kind of coat of paint swapping more between actual works of fiction than um, than just genres as a whole, I think, is kind of the best answer.
So that question, are visual aesthetics just a different kind of trope?
I would say
I mean,
I would say
you
that
say,
they
the way such and such looks or the way such and such behaves, that it sounds kind of like the same thing, as it's a recognizable
yeah,
piece of something.
I don't know if it's quite a trope. I would rather it might be. Like, honest, I'm not the one you should be quoting on this, but I see them more as like just a nugget of inspiration, whatever they are, or a thing that stands out about them, right? The thing that stands out about Palpatine to me is he's old and wrinkly, wears a cloak, and shoots lightning out of his fingers, right? And he laughs weirdly, And so I can have that aesthetic of who Palpatine is, and throw him in something else. Or I have the aesthetic of what a Warhammer 40k soldier looks like. Or I have the aesthetic of what the concept of spice is in Dune, as kind of like as a nugget of inspiration. And you can kind of twist it and mold it. Or like, what is the force power Star Wars? Or what is, the what is a lightsaber? Even you can just have lightsabers. I don't know why I'm leaning towards Star Wars so much, but it's they might be tropes,
It's
they
very
might not
prone
be.
for tropes.
Maybe, honestly, because it's I think it's because things are very iconic, um, and things can be visually iconic. And I think I'll say there, after talking more and realizing it more, I think that they're slightly distinct. You can have things that are tropically iconic and things that are visually iconic, and sometimes they mix. Some things can be in both, but um, I would say that like Darth Vader's helmet probably is visually iconic, but might not be a trope. It might be a trope about, evil dude wears a mask. Like we see that in Bane, see that in Darth Vader. We see that probably we saw that in Fallout New Vegas, kind of, um, for a really out there example. But evil people wearing a mask that helps them live is kind of a trope, I guess. But it's also like is visually powerful more than tropically powerful, I guess.
Yeah, that's
Maybe
a
it's
fair
both. Maybe
point,
I'm just
I think.
rambling. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that there is an argument for both interpretations. Darth Vader's helmet is, in fact, actually a trope because it's based off of a samurai's helmet,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why they shaped it that way, was because it kind of conjured up allegory. So it was referencing previous works of art. Yeah, I definitely think that it doesn't have to be a trope. But I think there are certain things that I would consider to be tropes of certain genres, iconic imagery and stuff. A lot of times, in my mind, is very synonymous with trope.
Yeah, like I think it would be more of a question of elements. Like, what elements does this thing have? So let's say you're like, okay, tell me about a samurai, right? Give me a list of things that make a samurai a samurai. You're like, okay, well, they have a katana or two, or they have this red armor, they have a mask, they ride a horse, they are a noble warrior, right? And you have kind of these list of things, and okay, they're pledged to a lord. All right, now put that in space. All right, they got a cool mask, they got a cool sword, lightsaber. They're pledged to a lord. Okay, so they're maybe they're a Sith Lord, or whatever. And all of a sudden you got space samurai that wield lightsabers, and all of a sudden are they Jedi? Who knows, right? But that's how you can kind of blend things in another way rather than just genre to genre. Is just like, okay, I want to have this iconic piece that most people can recognize. Like, okay, what makes a wizard, right? A big pointy hat, can cast spells, probably really old, right? Probably has very insidious goals, All right, put that in another genre. What does that look like in a Western? Right? Maybe their magic is actually either it is magic or it's a lot of money. Oh man, they're actually now a billionaire, etc. You can kind of just go down a rabbit hole of like adapting one thing to another genre's rules. To kind of like, if you were to take this thing and put it in another place, what would it actually look like? I did that example earlier with what would a 40K Marine look like in a fantasy world, right? Or what would a samurai look like in a space world? And that's kind of how you can get an idea for how to blend these two things together. Because let's say that having elite soldiers is important in another genre that you are taking inspiration from, or maybe samurai is an important element of another thing that you've done. Because like you can go to a genre and say, what's important to this genre? Well, I want samurai. I want a code of honor. I want the emperor to be involved. I want there to be some kind of romantic inclination that kind of like persuades the samurai to like fall from grace or something. And that's okay. Then now you have the pieces that you need for a different kind of story, and then take all those things and swap them all into another kind of genre. And how do they look like there? Is essentially my macro process to genre blend, and explaining it that way makes it seem pretty off the cuff and rambly, and a lot of just do it yourself and see what sticks instead of methodic.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's ingrained enough in my mind that I don't typically have like a process very much. I watch a lot of movies and a lot of television. I have for most of my life. I've played a lot of video games when I was younger, read a lot of comic books. So I've definitely consumed a lot of media, and I feel very comfortable in my ability to recognize something and understand kind of what they're touching on, to recognize, like you said, these touchstones, these tropes, elements, whatever we're calling them. So I don't have to think about it to have my gut kind of tell me where I need to take things. And when it becomes a process is more when I'm finalizing things, I guess. And I'm actually sitting down to say, okay, now it's time to really kind of make this concrete set. What do I really want to stay as a part of this? Then I will typically kind of dive in a little bit deeper and say, I really want to push the slider a little more. For example. So I'll go and do a little bit of research about that and find ways that I feel like that slider can be adjusted. But in the concept phase, at least in the very, very beginning, it's just, in the shower, in bed, driving. It's just mulling things over and just seeing what falls out and says, hey, this is not a bad idea.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just all instinctual at that point. Until you figure out that, man, I'm really not telling a blend of these two stories. I'm just kind of stealing an element or here or there. And if you're fine with that, then you're fine with that. Or otherwise, you can kind of, okay, sit down. Let's make this a bit more Western, or let's make this a bit more spacey, or make this a bit more fantasy, or make this a bit more cyberpunky. Right? You can kind of adjust from there as you're really laying the concrete out, as you said.
Awesome. Well, question to ask before we kind of wrap things up. Is there anything else about genre blending that you kind of want to touch on before we kind of head out with this final question?
I think I've touched on almost anything that I have to say on the subject, in some form or another, because my thoughts are not coherent ones. They're just merely rambles that I string together with a human tongue.
Welcome to the show.
Welcome to existence.
I mean, hey, yeah, we improv roleplay. That's what we do.
Yep.
So
that's all we can do.
The last question, yeah, indeed. The last question that I have for you is, in September of 2017, Hurricane Harvey hit my area and our house flooded. It turned our lives upside down, honestly, and we're still rebuilding, even point. When you can, here and there, bit by bit. But in the wake of that event, you particularly rallied the AbTab community and took up donations on our behalf in order to help me and my family. Now, we were almost complete strangers at that point, and you still took the initiative to reach out and help us. And that is something that I cannot thank you enough for. But I do have a question, and that is, how important is it to you to have a community that's built around gaming?
It is honestly, it feels like a very good, like, just a safe space, essentially, like where I can just be with fellow people that like the same things as me, and it's literally where all my friends come from. Um, Friends in the meat space, I often find they differ a bit too much in certain tastes or things that fall out. You can't spend enough time with them when things that don't matter as much between the two of you, and it's hard to keep friends in real life, I find. As an introvert, especially, is true when you never want to leave the house. But honestly, having people who just love the same things that I love, and even slightly different things that I love, but close enough that I can discover and, like, hey, you know what? I think this is actually pretty cool. Thanks for showing me this. Is just incredibly, incredibly cool, and letting and encountering people from all walks of life throughout the world, just meeting. Oh, hey, what are politics like in Ireland? What are they like in Australia? I'm curious. What's life like? In these different places that I will probably never visit. In the conceivable future. Having the world just be a much bigger place. Like, oh no, there's more to the world than a freezing tundra in which I live. There's a lot of other things and a lot of other issues hit a lot of other people, and it kind of leads into the point of, like, seeing someone so devastated by natural disaster. Like, well, I had to help, because, like, if that same thing happened to me, I would be clamoring for help too, and I would be wishing that someone would help me, even if I won't, like, yell at people, "Hey, please help me." I know that I would appreciate that help, and I think that being able to see how big the world is and see how people's lives are just as you know distinct and complicated as your own, is just a kind of a thing that you really only get access to when having such a broad sphere of people who are also really, really close to what you like. It's strange. It's like, the people are broad in a geographical sense, and but really, really narrow in a hobby sense. Like, okay, we all have this common ground of loving to death Dungeons and Dragons, for example, but everything else is quite different, and you get to really open your eyes to the whole breadth of people and the whole breadth of culture and slang. Honestly, you get to learn some new slang that things you just think is hilarious, or even accents. You're like, oh, this person has a cool accent. um, is such a unique experience that I would never give up.
I could not agree more. I think that community is important to us as humans. I think it's something that we need to have. We need to be understood on a certain level. I think that if we're not, it starts to break something in our psyche. Um, and it doesn't have to be physical. The place that you feel like you belong. Again, we live in such a time that now that can be a virtual space. It can be two friends that are sitting at several tens of degrees of temperature, but we can still communicate. There may be hiccups, tonight being a prime example, technologically speaking, whenever you rely on that kind of stuff. But it is still possible to maintain that kind of connectivity, that kind of relationship that I think that we really, really do need as people, even as introverts. We need that on some level. It's difficult to completely detach from that, and I think again, being human on some level, and a community, a good community, looks out for each other, emotionally, economically, in the case of your generosity, and I think that that's an important thing for people like us who do have a hard time connecting with muggles. You know, you go out in the other world and it feels the falsehood sometimes, and it's difficult to connect with a lot of people who don't understand where you're coming from. And I have always found a home with nerds. I've always been a nerd, and nerds are never afraid to be passionate about their loves in life, and I think that's a very endearing quality in human beings, when you can find people that are unabashedly into something. There's an appeal to that, and when they want to share that fosters a very good relationship, I have found. So it's always been very, very important to have a community and my passions kind of genre blended together, if you will, to have those two circles overlap. And yeah, like you said, it's fantastic that we can now do that on the other side of the globe. And people, like you said, of all walks of life, people like to meet normal circumstances. There's a really interesting article that I read a long time ago now, and I cannot remember what it was in. But it was about monkey spheres. And it basically was talking about how our brains, our primitive, evolved primate brains, can only care about so many people before the circle gets too big, the sphere around you gets too big for your attention to be spread amongst all of them. So inside your monkey sphere, is what they called it, were the people that you really cared about, that you checked in on frequently, that you kept up with their lives, and that if something were devastating to happen to them, you would jump to their need. And it was a really interesting article about how we kind of function as humans in a society. And I think when you develop a community, that can easily, that's the group of people that you're willing to go the extra distance for. And it touched me a lot whenever you reached out and did that for us, because it made me realize that we were part of the same monkey sphere. And to have someone tell you that, essentially, when you barely know each other, is a very, very just a very touching thing. So thank you, Connor.
It's honestly, it was, cannot say how much I appreciate like just everyone else contributing also to the same thing, because it wasn't just one person's effort that helped you and your family out. It wasn't just me. I'm not going to take almost any credit for that, because it was a wealth of people that all went together, a whole community, in fact, of people that said, hey, this person needs help. And sure, I took the initiative and set up a GoFundMe, but it's literally just the labor of hundreds of other people that also contributed. So it was a beautiful thing to see, even especially from my end. Like, oh wow, this thing worked. Even I might have been a bit skeptical at first, or a bit, kind of hopeless with it. I'm like, is this thing going to even work? As doubt crossed my mind, and then just seeing it work really well, I was just taken aback and kind of humbled with the generosity and grace of people in that time.
Yeah. Yeah, I was absolutely floored, and it's still something that when I think about it, makes me choke up. And absolutely, you are right. Thank you to everybody who was a part of that. I, yeah, I can't ever stop being grateful for that. I don't think that'll ever happen. But what will come to an end is this episode. And I think we're about there. So if you want to do any kind of outro, plug anything, have any kind of parting comments, what have you, then please keep them to yourself. No, I'm just kidding. Please go ahead and tell the people what you got.
Yeah, it's been great talking with you, Jeremy. It's really cool to really tackle into these more nuanced topics that a lot of people think about probably in the shower, but never really speak out about or can read about online. So I think this is a really good wealth of tools that honestly anyone can draw a bit of inspiration or help from. All 20 of these episodes, probably. I haven't watched them all, so there might be a doozy in there that you stay away from. But otherwise, it feels like a really great tool that probably hasn't really been done before, which is really cool. So keep these up. I'll be looking forward to seeing what other topics are being discussed here. It's really cool. And thanks everyone for listening to my rambles, because honestly, between my face and my rambling, I can't imagine how anyone would watch this video. But that being said, if you're really interested in that Cryfoth book,
They keep getting views. So.
Keep getting views. What's going on?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, man. The Cryfoth book, again, I cannot recommend that enough. Absolutely check it out. Come to the Absolute Tabletop official group, I think is the whole name of it, on Facebook. That's where Connor and I met each other, and many of our colleagues, peers, I don't know.
Men at arms.
What you want to go. They all kind of gather. So, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, we've been talking about genre blending. It's been a lot of fun. Like I said, Connor, I wanted to have you on the channel for some time, and I just wanted to find the right topic to kind of sit down and discuss with you. It's one of the things that I really try to strive for with these. Is it's not just getting anybody in any topic and just going for it. I try to find something that I think the other person is going to be either passionate about with any luck, and then try to come up with ways that I want to pick your brain for my own edification, to help me along as I'm developing as a game master and as a storyteller, as a player. So this is the kind of stuff that I want to know. So I'm really hoping that it's useful for people out there, as well as hopefully entertaining. So I'm glad to hear that at least some of the episodes have made it across your monitor.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, man. It was a blast. All right, everyone. I think that's about it for us. So I will be running the first game of the year here on the channel on Monday night. It will be Shades. It is going to be set in and using the system designed by Jeff Doty called Glyph. It's going to be a crazy deco punk. I'm kind of learning is kind of the typical genre that it might fall under. It's definitely going to be a lot of genre blending going on in the game, and I hope it's going to be a lot of fun. So hopefully I will see you guys for watching and tuning in tonight, or if you are watching in the future, thank you as well. And until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.